Frank Carruthers stared at the map spread across his kitchen table. Red lines marked the trails he had conquered with Marlene. Blue ones showed the paths he planned to walk alone. She always said the Colorado mountains healed hearts. Now he hoped they would do the opposite. Morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the empty Denver house. 3 months after the funeral, only the refrigerator's hum broke the silence. Frank folded the map with the determination of a man who had made his final decision. For 40 years, he had saved people from fire. Now, it was time to save himself from emptiness. The backpack packed itself automatically. 40 years of firefighting experience had taught him to take only the essentials: canned food for 5 days, sleeping bag, first aid kit. Frank placed his hand on Marlene's red jacket. She always wore it on hikes, said the red color gave her confidence. He folded the jacket and placed it on top. The drive to the Rocky Mountains took 2 hours. Frank drove in silence, listening to country music. Marlene loved those songs. Now every melody reminded him of her laughter. He turned off the radio and continued in silence. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty. Mid-October wasn't the best time for hiking. Frank tied his boots and checked his GPS. The right led to Blue Sapphire Lake. Marlene had dreamed of reaching it. They had planned to go in spring. Spring never came for her. The first 2 hours went easily. The paved path gave way to a dirt trail. Pine forests surrounded Frank on all sides. He stopped every half hour, as Marlene had taught him, drank water in small sips, listened to forest sounds, tried not to think about how no one was waiting for him at home. Clouds began gathering after lunch. Frank watched the sky with the professional attention of a former rescue worker. The wind was picking up. Temperature was dropping faster than the forecast predicted. He checked his watch. 4 hours until dark. 6 more kilometers of climbing to the lake. Marlene always told him to trust his instincts. Something in the air had changed. Birds fell silent. Even the evergreen pines swayed restlessly. Frank stopped by a large boulder and pulled out his map. He could turn back. It would be smart to turn back. But reason hadn't brought him here. He looked at Marlene's photograph in his wallet. She smiled from the picture clipped to his backpack. Their last trip to the Grand Canyon. She didn't know about the illness then. They still had a future then. Frank tucked the photo away and continued upward. Snow began falling an hour later. Light flakes at first, then heavier. The trail became slippery. Frank pulled out his trekking poles and slowed his pace. Experience told him to stop and make camp. His heart said to continue. His heart won. The wind strengthened with each minute. Snow flew almost horizontally. Frank pulled up his hood and bent his head. He was walking blind now, guided only by GPS. The device showed the right direction, but there was no trail under his feet anymore. Only a white carpet that was rapidly thickening. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet disappeared. Frank felt himself falling into darkness. The last thing he saw was a red danger sign on the cliff that flashed past him. Then there was silence, and pain in his left leg that pierced his entire body. Frank lay at the bottom of a small ravine, looking up. A snow cloud had covered the sky. The GPS lay nearby, broken. His cell phone had no signal. His left leg wouldn't obey. He tried to stand and groaned in pain. A fracture, maybe more than one. Cold quickly penetrated his clothing. Frank knew he had to act fast. find shelter, build a fire, wait for morning. But part of his soul whispered something else. The part that was tired of fighting. The part that wanted to simply close his eyes and join Marlene forever. He closed his eyes and felt snow covering his face. Frank woke to absolute silence. The kind of silence that comes before death. Snow had stopped falling, but the world above the ravine remained white and hostile. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory of his body like he'd done after every dangerous rescue call. Left leg, definitely broken below the knee. Right shoulder, bruised but functional. Ribs, at least 2 cracked. Head, clear enough to think, which meant he still had a chance. 40 years of pulling people from burning buildings had taught him one thing: panic kills faster than any injury. He pushed himself up against the ravine wall. The movement sent lightning through his leg. Frank bit back a scream and reached for his backpack. The emergency whistle hung from a carabiner. 3 sharp blasts echoed off the rocky walls. He waited, listened. Nothing. The ravine was deeper than he'd first realized. Maybe 20 feet down. The walls were steep granite, slick with ice. Even with 2 good legs, climbing out would be nearly impossible. Frank looked up at the narrow strip of gray sky. Storm clouds were building again. His watch showed 3 in the afternoon. In October, darkness came early in the mountains. Frank had maybe 4 hours to prepare for a night that could kill him. He opened his pack and spread the contents on the snow. Sleeping bag, emergency bivvy, waterproof matches, enough food for 4 more days. Marlene's red jacket lay on top, still folded. Frank held it against his chest. Her perfume had faded months ago, but somehow he could still smell it. She would have known what to do. Marlene had always been the practical one, the planner, the survivor. "Okay, honey," he whispered to the jacket. "Help me figure this out." The first priority was shelter. Frank crawled toward a slight overhang in the rock wall. Every movement was agony, but movement meant life. He swept snow away with his hands until he found bare ground. The spot was barely large enough for his body, but it would block the wind. Setting up the emergency bivvy took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Frank's hands shook from cold and shock. Twice, he had to stop and breathe through waves of nausea. But finally, he had a small orange cocoon against the rock face. Next came fire. Frank gathered what dry wood he could find, mostly small branches and pine needles. Not much, but enough for a small flame. He arranged stones in a circle and struck his first match. Nothing. The wind had picked up again. Second match. A tiny flame caught the pine needles, flickered, died. Frank closed his eyes and tried to remember every survival technique he'd learned. Cup your hands. Block the wind with your body. Start with the smallest kindling. He struck the third match and cupped it carefully. A small flame. But 10 precious minutes, Frank had fire. He fed it twigs and watched smoke rise toward the gray sky. Maybe someone would see it. Maybe a rescue team was already looking. Maybe he wasn't going to die alone in this hole. Then the wind shifted. Snow began falling again, harder than before. His fire died with a final hiss. Frank stared at the blackened circle of stones. 40 years of saving others, and he couldn't even save himself. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so final. He crawled into his bivvy and zipped it closed. The orange fabric glowed around him like a dying campfire. Frank pulled Marlene's jacket over his chest and tried to conserve body heat. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury. Inside, Despair settled over him like a burial shroud. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to wind or snow. A low whine, barely audible above the storm. Frank held his breath and listened. There it was again, closer. Something was moving outside his shelter. Something alive. Frank unzipped the bivvy enough to peer out. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a shadow moved against the far wall of the ravine, low to the ground, limping. A coyote emerged from the white curtain, dragging its right hind leg. The animal's fur was matted with blood and ice. One ear hung at an odd angle. It moved with the careful determination of a creature that knew injury meant death. Frank froze. He'd encountered coyotes before during mountain rescues. Usually, they ran from humans. This one didn't run. It couldn't run. Instead, it collapsed against the opposite wall and fixed Frank with amber eyes that held no fear. Only pain. Only exhaustion. They stared at each other across 8 feet of space. 2 wounded predators, trapped in the same hole. The coyote's breathing was labored. Frank could see its ribs moving beneath the matted fur. Yet whatever had happened to it had been recent. The blood was still red against the snow. Frank's first instinct was to make noise, scare it away. But the animal looked as trapped as he felt. Its right leg was useless. Even if it wanted to attack, it could barely move. The wind picked up again, sending snow spiraling down into their shared prison. The coyote shivered and tried to curl into a tighter ball. Its amber eyes never left Frank's face. "Well," Frank whispered, "looks like we're both having a bad day." The coyote's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, not with aggression, but with something like recognition. As if it understood that they were no longer predator and prey, just 2 broken creatures seeking shelter from the storm. Frank reached slowly into his pack. The coyote tensed, but didn't move. Frank pulled out a can of beef stew and popped it open. The smell filled the small space between them. He looked at the wounded animal, looked at his own meager supplies. 4 days of food, if he was careful. 3, if he was generous. "You know what, friend?" Frank said softly. "Maybe we're supposed to help each other." He spooned half the stew onto a flat rock and slid it slowly across the space between them. The coyote watched every movement. When the rock stopped halfway between them, the animal hesitated for a long moment. Then hunger won over caution. The coyote dragged itself forward and began to eat. As darkness fell over the ravine, Frank listened to the sound of another creature fighting to survive. For the first time in months, he wasn't alone. For the first time since Marlene's death, he had a reason to see tomorrow. But as snow continued to fall and the temperature dropped, Frank wondered if tomorrow would come for either of them. The longest night of Frank's life began with a sound he'd never forget. The coyote was dreaming, whimpering in its sleep. Small, desperate sounds that reminded him of the victims he'd pulled from burning buildings. The sounds of someone fighting battles they couldn't win. Frank lay in his bivvy, listening to snow pelt the orange fabric above his head. The temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. His breath came out in white puffs that froze instantly. Through the thin material, he could hear the coyote shifting restlessly across the ravine. At 2 in the morning, the animal's breathing changed, became labored, desperate. Frank unzipped his shelton and peered out. The coyote lay on its side, barely moving. Its injured leg had swollen badly. In the moonlight filtering down, Frank could see the animal's flanks heaving with each difficult breath. "Hey, buddy," Frank whispered. "You still with me?" The coyote's amber eyes opened slowly, fixed on Frank's face. There was something in that gaze that hit him like a physical blow. The same look he'd seen in Marlene's eyes during those final weeks. The look of someone fighting to stay, even when leaving would be easier. Frank made a decision that surprised him. He unzipped his bivvy completely and crawled out into the freezing night. Every movement sent fire through his broken leg, but he kept moving. The coyote watched him approach, but didn't try to flee. "Easy, friend," Frank murmured. "Let me take a look." Up close, the animal's injuries were worse than he'd thought. The right hind leg was badly mangled, probably caught in a trap, then twisted during escape. The torn ear was infected, but it was the labored breathing that worried Frank most. He'd seen enough trauma to recognize the signs. Internal injuries, maybe internal bleeding. The coyote was dying, and they both knew it. Frank sat back on his heels, fighting waves of dizziness from the cold and pain. He could crawl back to his shelter, save his strength, save his supplies, let nature take its course. It would be the smart thing to do. Instead, he opened his first aid kit. "Marlene always said I was too stubborn for my own good," he told the coyote as he unwrapped gauze. Guess she was right. The animal lay perfectly still as Frank cleaned its wounds, as if it understood that this human was trying to help. Frank worked by moonlight, his hands numb with cold, but steady from decades of emergency medicine training. The leg was beyond his ability to set properly, but he could clean it, bandage it, give the animal a fighting chance. Frank used most of his antibiotic ointment and half his gauze, medical supplies he might need for himself later. "There," he said softly, tying off the last bandage. "That's the best I can do." The coyote turned its head and did something extraordinary. It licked Frank's hand, once, gently, a gesture of gratitude that brought tears to the old firefighter's eyes. Frank crawled back to his bivvy, but he didn't zip it closed. Instead, he arranged his sleeping bag so he could see the coyote. The animal had lifted its head slightly, still breathing hard, but breathing. "You know what your problem is?" Frank said conversationally. "You don't know when to quit. Marlene had the same problem." The coyote's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. "She fought cancer for 2 years. Doctors said 6 months, tops. But Marlene, she kept going, kept hoping, right up until the end." Frank's voice caught. "I used to wish she'd just let go, stop fighting so hard. It was killing me to watch her suffer." Snow continued falling outside their rocky shelter. Frank pulled Marlene's red jacket tighter around his shoulders. "Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe the fighting was the point. Maybe giving up is what kills you, not the cancer, not the cold, not the broken bones." The coyote had closed its eyes, but its breathing seemed easier. Frank watched the rise and fall of its ribs and felt something shift inside his chest. For months, he'd been carrying death around like a stone. Tonight, for the first time, he was choosing life. Dawn came gray and bitter cold. Frank woke to find the coyote watching him. The animal was sitting up, which was a good sign. Its eyes were clearer, alert. "Mornin', buddy," Frank said. His own voice was hoarse from the cold. "How are you feeling?" The coyote stood carefully on 3 legs and limped toward Frank's shelter. It stopped just outside arm's reach and sat down, waiting. Frank opened a can of tuna and divided it between them. They ate in companionable silence as weak sunlight filtered down into the ravine. For the first time since falling, Frank allowed himself to hope. That hope nearly killed them both. The sound started as a distant rumble. Frank looked up at the strip of sky above them, confused. It wasn't thunder, too steady, too mechanical. Then he understood. Helicopter. Frank grabbed his emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts. The sound echoed off the canyon walls. He waited, listened. The helicopter was getting closer. "They're looking for us," Frank told the Coyote. He fumbled for his signal mirror, trying to catch what little sunlight was available. "Someone reported us missing." But even as he flashed the mirror frantically, Frank realized the terrible truth. The helicopter was following the main trail, the trail he'd left when the storm hit. They were searching in the wrong place. The mechanical sound grew louder, then began to fade. Frank blew his whistle until his lungs burned, shouted until his voice cracked, flashed his mirror until his hands shook with exhaustion. The helicopter moved away, toward the distant lake, away from their prison. Frank slumped against the rock wall, devastated. So close. They'd been so close to rescue. He covered his face with his hands and felt 40 years of strength finally break. That's when the Coyote did something that changed everything. The animal stood on its 3 good legs and tilted its head back. From its throat came a sound Frank had heard in nature documentaries but never in person. A wild, mournful howl that seemed to carry across the entire mountain range. The Coyote howled once, twice. On the 3rd howl, another voice joined it, distant but clear. Another coyote somewhere on the mountain. Then another, and another. Soon, the mountains rang with a chorus of wild voices, a network of communication that spanned miles. The helicopter sound changed direction. Frank stared at his wounded companion in amazement. "You called for backup." The Coyote looked at him with what Frank could have sworn was satisfaction, as if to say, "Now you're learning." The helicopter sound grew stronger, closer. Frank grabbed his mirror again and positioned himself where he could reflect sunlight toward the approaching aircraft. This time, he had help. The Coyote pack continued their course, guiding their human rescuers like a living GPS system. When the first rescue worker rappelled down into the ravine 20 minutes later, he found something he'd never seen before in 15 years of mountain rescue. A man and a wild coyote sitting side by side, both looking up expectantly. "Well," the rescuer said into his radio, "this is a new one. We've got your missing hiker, and he's got a friend." Frank looked at the coyote as the rescue harness was lowered down. The animal met his gaze steadily. Between them passed an understanding that needed no words. They had saved each other. But more than that, they had learned something about the difference between surviving and living. As Frank was lifted toward the sky, he could hear the coyote pack still calling across the mountains. A wild song of connection that reminded him of something Marlene used to say. "No one heals alone." The morphine made everything soft round the edges. Frank drifted in and out of consciousness in the Denver General Hospital room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of medical equipment, beeping monitors, hushed conversations in the hallway, the whisper of rubber soles on linoleum floors. He'd spent enough time in hospitals during Marlene's illness to know these rhythms by heart. But this time was different. This time, he was the patient. This time, he wanted to heal. Dr. Sarah Martinez pulled up a chair beside his bed on the second day. Frank liked her immediately. She had the no-nonsense manner of someone who'd seen enough trauma to cut through pleasantries. "The leg will heal," she said, checking his chart. Clean break, well set, then physical therapy. The ribs will take about the same time. You're lucky, Mr. Carruthers. Another night in those temperatures? What about the Coyote? Frank interrupted. Dr. Martinez looked surprised. The animal? Fish and Wildlife took it to a rehabilitation center in Boulder. They said it was touch and go for a while. Frank felt something tight in his chest ease slightly. Will it survive? I'm not a veterinarian, but from what I heard, yes. Thanks to the first aid someone gave it in the field. The ranger said whoever bandaged that leg probably saved its life. Frank closed his eyes and smiled for the first time in months. His son Michael arrived that afternoon, bursting through the door with the frantic energy of someone who'd driven straight through from Phoenix. Frank watched his eldest child, now 43 and graying at the temples, struggle with emotions he'd never been good at expressing. "Dad, what the hell were you thinking?" Michael said, collapsing into the visitor's chair. "Going up there, alone, in October, without telling anyone your route?" Frank studied his son's face, saw Marlene's worry lines around the eyes, her stubborn chin. I needed to get to the lake. Blue Sapphire? That place you and Mom talked about? Michael's voice softened. Dad, she's gone. That trip, it wouldn't have brought her back. I know that. Frank shifted carefully in the hospital bed. I wasn't trying to bring her back. I was trying to join her. The words hung in the air between them. Michael's face went pale. Dad, it's okay, son. I'm past that now. Frank reached for his son's hand. Something happened up there. Something I can't quite explain. Over the next hour, Frank told Michael about the storm, the fall, the long night with a wounded coyote, the rescue guided by wild voices calling across the mountains. His son listened with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a language he'd never heard before. A coyote, Michael said finally. You risked your life for a coyote? We risked our lives for each other, Frank corrected. There's a difference. That evening, alone again, Frank called the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Boulder. The woman who answered was named Katie, and she had the patient voice of someone who fielded many worried calls about injured animals. The coyote you're asking about is doing well, she said. Better than we expected, actually. The leg is healing nicely. No signs of infection. We've named him Ranger, after the Park Service officer who brought him in. When will you release him? Maybe another week or two. We like to be sure they can hunt and defend themselves before we let them go. Katie paused. Are you the hiker who was found with him? The one who provided medical care? Yes. That was incredible work. Most people wouldn't have risked their supplies for a wild animal. You probably saved his life. Frank stared out the hospital window at the Denver skyline. He saved mine, too. After he hung up, Frank lay in the darkened room thinking about the conversation. For the first time since Marlene's death, he had plans that extended beyond tomorrow. He wanted to know what happened to Ranger, wanted to see the animal run free again. The next few days blurred together in a haze of physical therapy sessions and visits from friends he hadn't seen in months. Word of his rescue had spread through the firefighter community. Old colleagues stopped by with stories and jokes and the easy camaraderie of people who'd faced danger together. Frank found himself laughing, actually laughing. The sound felt rusty from disuse, but real. On Thursday, his daughter Emma flew in from Seattle. She was Marlene's daughter in temperament, practical, caring, unafraid of difficult conversations. She sat beside his bed and got straight to the point. Michael says you went up there to die. I went up there because I didn't know how to live, Frank said. There's a difference. Emma considered this. And now? Frank thought about the coyote's amber eyes, the feeling of having a purpose beyond his own pain, the sound of wild voices calling across empty spaces. Now I think maybe I'm ready to learn. Emma squeezed his hand. Good, because Mom would kick your ass if you gave up now. You know she would. Frank laughed again. Emma was right. Marlene had never tolerated quitters. Dr. Martinez discharged him on Friday with a walking cast and strict instructions about weight-bearing. Michael wanted him to come to Phoenix, at least for a few weeks. Emma lobbied for Seattle. Frank thanked them both and booked a hotel room in Boulder instead. Boulder? Michael looked confused. Why Boulder? Frank gathered his discharge papers and Marlene's red jacket. I need to see about a friend. The rehabilitation center sat on 40 acres of grassland at the base of the Flatirons. Frank arrived Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and no real plan except to be nearby when Ranger was released. Katie turned out to be a woman in her 30s with dirt under her fingernails and genuine love for her work. She led Frank to a large enclosure where a familiar shape limped across natural terrain. He's remarkable, Katie said, watching the coyote test his repaired leg against a fallen log. Most animals that injured would have given up, but this one kept fighting, like he had something to live for. Frank gripped the fence wire. Ranger looked up at the sound of their voices and froze. For a long moment, amber eyes met human eyes across 20 feet of space. The coyote limped closer to the fence, stopped just out of arm's reach, sat down. "Well, I'll be damned," Katie whispered. "He recognizes you." Frank and Ranger studied each other through the chain link. The animal looked stronger, healthier, ready to return to his wild life. But there was something in his posture that suggested patience, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "We're planning to release him tomorrow morning," Katie said. "Early, before too many people are around. Would you like to be here?" Frank nodded, not trusting his voice. That night, in his Boulder hotel room, Frank called his children, told them he was staying in Colorado for a while, maybe permanently. There were things he needed to figure out, a life he needed to rebuild. He also called a real estate agent about putting the Denver house on the market, the house where he and Marlene had been happy for 30 years. It was time to let someone else fill those rooms with laughter. As he hung up the phone, Frank realized something had shifted fundamentally inside him. For months, he'd been focused on ending his story. Now he was thinking about beginning a new chapter. Outside his hotel window, the mountains rose black against a star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, wild voices still called to each other across the darkness. Tomorrow, Ranger would join that ancient conversation, and Frank would begin learning how to live again. But first, he had one more goodbye to say, one more beginning to witness. As he settled into sleep, Frank found himself looking forward to tomorrow for the first time in months. The healing, he realized, had already begun. Dawn came quietly to the Colorado foothills. Frank arrived at the rehabilitation center as the first light touched the mountains, carrying a thermos of coffee and Marlene's red jacket folded under his arm. Katie was already there, preparing the transport cage with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "Ready?" she asked, though Frank could see in her eyes that she understood this wasn't really a question. Some things you were never ready for. You just did them anyway. Ranger sat alert in his enclosure, as if he knew this day was different. His injured leg had healed remarkably well. There was still a slight limp, but the wildlife veterinarian had pronounced him fit for release. The coyote's amber eyes tracked every moment as Katie opened the transport cage. "We're taking him up to Rocky Mountain National Park," Katie explained, "about 20 miles from where you two were found, his pack territory. If any of his family survive the winter, he'll find them." Frank nodded but didn't speak. He was thinking about families, about survival, about the ways we find each other in the darkness. Loading Ranger into the transport took 15 minutes. The coyote didn't fight or panic. He seemed to understand that this journey was toward freedom, not away from it. As Katie secured the cage in her truck, Frank caught the animal's gaze through the metal bars. "Almost home, buddy," he said softly. The drive into the mountains was familiar territory for Frank now. The same roads he'd traveled 3 weeks ago with death on his mind. Today felt different. The mountains looked the same, but he was seeing them with new eyes. Eyes that noticed the way morning light caught on pine needles, the way clouds moved across peaks like gentle spirits. They stopped at a meadow 10 miles from the ravine where Frank and Ranger had been found. It was perfect coyote country. Open grassland bordered by forest with a stream running through the middle. Katie parked near a cluster of aspens whose leaves had turned brilliant gold. "This is it," she said. "Are you sure you want to do this? Sometimes it's easier to just—" "I need to," Frank said. He understood Katie's hesitation. Most people preferred clean endings. Drop the animal and drive away. Don't look back. Don't think about what happened next. But Frank had learned something in that ravine. Endings were just another kind of beginning. Katie positioned the transport cage at the edge of the meadow and stepped back. Frank hobbled forward on his walking cast and knelt beside the metal door. Through the bars, Ranger watched him with those knowing amber eyes. "This is where we say goodbye," Frank said. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he reached for the latch. "Time for you to go home." He opened the cage door and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Ranger sat perfectly still, as if weighing his options. Freedom lay just steps away, but something held him back. "Go on," Frank whispered. "It's okay. You're safe now." The coyote stood slowly, testing his weight on the healed leg. Took one careful step toward the open door, then another. Frank held his breath. Ranger emerged from the cage and stood in the meadow grass, lifting his nose to test the wind. His ears swiveled, listening for sounds only wild animals could hear. For a moment, Frank thought he might simply run into the forest and disappear forever. Instead, the coyote turned and looked directly at him. They studied each other across 5 feet of morning air. 2 survivors who had shared the longest night of their lives. In Ranger's gaze, Frank saw something that took his breath away. Not gratitude exactly, something deeper. Recognition, understanding. "I know," Frank said softly. "I feel it too." The coyote took 3 careful steps toward Frank and sat down just out of arm's reach, exactly as he had done at the fence yesterday, waiting. Frank understood. This wasn't goodbye. This was something else entirely. He pulled Marlene's red jacket from under his arm and held it out. The fabric fluttered slightly in the mountain breeze. "She would have liked you," Frank said. "She always said that courage comes in different shapes." The coyote's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. "I carried this jacket because I thought it would help me find her. But I think maybe she wanted me to find you instead," Frank's voice caught. "Maybe she wanted me to remember what it feels like to save something instead of losing it." Ranger stood, and took another step closer. Close enough that Frank could see the intelligence in those amber eyes. Close enough to touch, if he dared. "I'm going to be okay," Frank said. "I'm going to learn how to live again. And you're going to run with your pack and hunt and be wild and free. That's how it's supposed to be." The coyote tilted his head, listening. "But I'll remember. Every day I'll remember that we saved each other. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything." A sound echoed across the meadow then, distant but unmistakable. A coyote's call, wild and lonely and beautiful. Ranger's head snapped toward the sound, his whole body suddenly alert. Another call answered the first, then another. The pack was calling their lost member home. Ranger looked at Frank one last time. In that gaze was everything they couldn't say. Goodbye and thank you, and may you find what you're looking for. Then he turned and trotted toward the forest, his limp barely noticeable. At the tree line, he stopped, looked back once. Frank raised his hand in a small wave. "Go," he whispered. "Go be free." Ranger lifted his head and howled, a long, wild sound that seemed to carry all the way to the peaks. The pack answered immediately, their voices weaving together in a song of welcome and belonging. Frank watched until the coyote disappeared into the shadows of the pine forest. Then he stood in the quiet meadow, listening to the wild music fade into the distance. Katie appeared beside him. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "I've never seen anything like it." Frank nodded, not trusting his voice. "What will you do now?" she asked. Frank looked around the meadow, at the mountains rising on all sides, at the aspens dancing in the morning wind. He thought about his empty house in Denver, about his children waiting for answers, about all the years ahead that suddenly seemed full of possibility instead of emptiness. "I think I'll stay in Colorado," he said finally. "Maybe see if you folks need any help around the center. I've got some experience with trauma recovery." Katie smiled. "We always need volunteers, especially ones who understand what it means to heal." As they drove back down the mountain, Frank rolled down his window and listened to the sounds of the wild. Somewhere up there, Ranger was running with his pack again. Somewhere up there, the ancient cycles of survival and renewal continued. Frank pulled out his phone and scrolled to Michael's number. His son would want to know he was safe, that he'd made his decision about the future. But first, he had one more call to make. "Denver General Hospital," the operator answered. "Dr. Martinez, please. This is Frank Carruthers." When the doctor came on the line, Frank smiled at the sound of her voice. "Doc, I wanted to thank you for everything you did, and to ask you something. I'm thinking about volunteering with animal rescue. What kind of training would I need to update my medical skills?" Dr. Martinez laughed. "Planning to make a career out of treating wounded wildlife?" "Something like that," Frank said, watching the mountains roll past his window. "I figure I've got some experience in helping things heal." After he hung up, Frank leaned back in the passenger seat and closed his eyes. For the first time in months, the silence in his head was peaceful instead of empty. For the first time since Marlene's death, he wasn't carrying the weight of endings. He was thinking about beginnings, about second chances, about the way broken things could heal stronger than before. Somewhere in the mountains, a wild song continued, and Frank Carruthers drove toward his new life, ready to join the chorus. The mountains had indeed healed his heart, just not in the way he'd expected.